Hello my dear viewers. Welcome to another episode. A new episode here about a close call world disaster that was going to happen. I won't say if it happened or not, I'll leave it as a surprise because I'm not used to giving it away at the beginning so that you stick around till the end of it. I'm not new to this. On the 4th of October 1957, during the Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union, if you didn't know that, the world was taken back by the Soviets' launch of Sputnik, the first satellite sent to space. While the world was celebrating this scientific achievement, the US papers are issued with shocking headlines, like, "Sorry ABO Meade, but it's not that big of a deal, it's just a satellite, not an atomic bomb." And what does Liverpool have to do with it? Where was Salah playing? Wait you hasty, wait. Don't you want some coffee? Let me tell you that the Americans were terrified that the Soviets' ability to launch a satellite from Earth to outer space meant that they can design intercontinental nuclear missiles. The technology that enabled them to do this would make them do that. It was easy for them then to reach the US and strike it. This killed an extra point that the US had, with its geographical distance from Europe. With these missiles in a press of a button from Moscow, it could launch an atomic bomb to Washington, all the way from Europe with an ocean in the middle. ABO Meade, we shouldn't take any fear seriously. My friend, that wasn't an imaginary fear. The scientist Sergei Korolyov, who was responsible for the Soviet space program, was the one who designed the first intercontinental missile, the ICBM. After Sputnik, another panic mania appears in Europe, and in 1949, it formed the NATO with the US. It was a common defense agreement that if the Soviets struck the US, Europe had to intervene in the war. The French leader Charles de Gaulle said, "What, ABO Meade?" Meaning, since you don't know French, America cannot head defending Paris while Detroit can be destroyed by an ICBM. What does this one mean, ABO Meade? Just coughing. That's why the American President Eisenhower decided in December 1957 to hold an urgent meeting for the NATO in Paris. This meeting led to a decision that changed the history of the Cold War. The Jupiter missiles. The US decided to place the Jupiter missiles, which are medium-range ballistic missile, in Turkey and Italy. Turkey, my friend, has common borders with the Soviet Union, so the missiles could reach Moscow in 16 minutes. With these agreements, the US restored its military advancement and threatened the Soviets on their borders. But this would all change on the 1st of January 1959. Congrats, my friend. On what, ABO Meade? The Cuban Revolution succeeded, led by Fidel Castro and Che Guevara. Wait, ABO Meade, Guevara the shirts brand? You just insulted a people and a movement, and insulted so many things now, shut it. Fidel Castro and Che Guevara succeeded in taking down the dictator Fulgencio Batista and declaring it a socialist republic. What? My friend, the problem wasn't with Cuba. It's a small country with a small economy that the US had under its wing, especially the sugar exports. The problem was with Cuba's location, as it was 90 miles away from Florida. Cuba was almost an American state. So when a communist country appears here, it's danger to the US security. Instead of the US directly meddling with taking down Castro's system, the CIA decided to train 1,400 Cuban fighters opposing Fidel Castro. These people escaped Cuba during the revolution. And Castro was the infidel that stayed? Actually, he did stay there. Those 1,400 men escaped during the revolution, and in the 17th of April 1961, these fighters were dropped off on the Bay of Pigs to start the invasion. Of course they took down Castro. ABO Meade, it's the CIA. Perfect training and developed weapons, they definitely took him down. Actually, the invasion ended in 72 hours, with the surrender of 1,200 fighters and a crushing win for Fidel Castro. The US, with all its glory, with its nuclear weapons and its scientific and economic development, couldn't match his undoubted popularity. He had the entire people on his side. What happened made this one of the most failed intelligence missions in history. In an interview of Che Guevara with White House advisor Dick Goodwin, he sarcastically thanked the US for it. Hey, thanks for the Bay of Pigs mission. That turned Cuba into a US enemy and the whole world was talking about it. But what does all of this have to do with missiles? That's what we'll know after the break. I'll go for a dramatic exit and return dramatically. What did the Soviet leader Khrushchev do? He said, "A communist country close to the US. Let's shake hands." Their close ship made it as far as him saying he considers Castro as his son. That's because Castro gave him the magical solution that restored the balance of the Cold War that was imbalanced by the NATO's missiles in Turkey and Italy. On the 14th of October 1962, and during regular checkups on Cuba, the American spy plane U-2 showed strange bodies on the ground. The expert Dino Brugioni analyzed the photos and he found a surprise. The photos captured a military base with the Soviet S-44 missiles. Nuclear mid-range missiles ready for install, that sat away from the US by 19 miles. While the Jupiter missiles in Turkey can reach Moscow in 15 minutes, listen to this, the S-44 missiles could fly from Cuba to Washington, the US capital, in 13 minutes only. What, abo me? Minus 13 minutes. Before you destroy me by 3 minutes, I'd have erased you. Single quote. The US President John Kennedy on the 4th of September 1962 warned the Soviet of arming Cuba with heavy weapons. But he didn't know that Khrushchev, with his alliance with Castro, succeeded in not only passing through a missile or 2, or 3 or 10 or 20 or 30, but passed 42 nuclear missiles. How? On the back of commercial ships that he sent under the US sight. Khrushchev announced it as a reality. You do you. The missiles are already there. You'll strike me from Turkey, I'll strike you from Cuba. In only 13 minutes. But the coincidence blew the plan's cover before it was complete. In that moment, the most dangerous crisis in the history of Cold War started, with the doomsday clock, the metaphorical clock of nuclear extinction. That clock of nuclear extinction ticked till 7 minutes before midnight. So 11:53? I'm usually asleep by then, the world would fall apart as I sleep? In Kennedy's meeting on the 18th of October 1962, the Army generals and his brother Robert Kennedy advised him to invade Cuba with the Marines. What? Invade Cuba? The CIA informed him that according to its intel, there were 5,000 Soviet soldiers in Cuba, so they could operate the missiles base. Fortunately for the Americans, this was a small number that could allow them to get in and get the job done before they install the missiles and threaten Washington. Kennedy refused that. Because during the Cold War, all the wars of the two parties, the US and the Soviets, was through agencies. What brought them to a talent agency, abo Meade? No, not this one, my friend, I meant proxy warfare. Anyway, this proxy warfare was through each party having ally country and fighting using them. There was no direct, this versus that war, we're in a war using North Vietnam and South Vietnam. The US versus the Soviet confrontation army to army wouldn't stop at just clashes, it would create a third world war. If we fought army to army and not through proxies, we would enter a world war, the plant would be destroyed 3 times. After the infamous Bay of Pigs incident, Kennedy no longer had any trust for the CIA's intel. What's interesting is that this hesitation and lack of confidence saved the world. Imagine that you're alive today because of someone's trust issues. According to the archive that was unlocked in 1992, let me tell you that this cute, nice CIA that we see in movies, they said 5,000 men. Do you know how many were really there? There were 43,000 Soviet troops, and while the mid-ranged ICBM base wasn't all ready, there was in Cuba short-ranged nuclear ballistic missiles that were ready to deal with any invasion. The power of one missile of them equated a Hiroshima bomb. If Kennedy had decided to invade and trusted the CIA, there would have been a nuclear war. On the 22nd of October, Kennedy announced their discovery of the missiles on TV, and decided to impose a quarantine on Cuba, to prevent any more weapons reaching Cuba, and demanding the Soviet to move the missiles back. How is there a quarantine on a country? Abo Meade, it's no virus. This was a diplomatic intended term, my friend. Instead of saying, naval blockade, he said, quarantine. Instead of saying directly that it's a naval siege and turn it into a military crisis and all that, he just said, quarantine. If you, as a US president, said you're issuing a naval blockade, you declared war. But when you use wordplay, and say, quarantine, then it's just a quarantine. We're not saying naval blockade, or any military elements. It was a smart move from the US though. He saved himself. Actually no he didn't, nor did he save the US. During broadcasting the announcement there were 4 Soviet submarines. Wait, where is the CIA? Where's the CIA? Why am I not told these things? These 4 submarines were already set in the Sargasso Sea under Cuba. These submarines were undetected because in October 1962 the Caribbean area was hit by Hurricane Ella. The hurricane caused the wave's height to go up to 7 meters. It succeeded to cover up the submarines from detection by sonar and planes, until these submarines reached the Cuban coastlines. Some men were sitting and said, "Oh, is that a fish?" While the submarines settled underwater, the world above waters was starting to get tensed. On the 24th of October, Khrushchev refused the quarantine, and assured that the ships would arrive to Cuba, and described the US actions as piratical acts. The world put his hands on his heart, and knew it was over. According to Thomas Blanton, director of National Security Archive, in a few hours, the US people had stored canned and primary goods. We'll enter the bunkers and won't leave. This resulted in the backyard of every house, there was a hideout for the family to hide in when the nuclear war started. At that time, there was a campaign called Duck and Cover. A civil defense campaign to tell people what to do in case of a nuclear attack. My friend, I call it the poultry campaign, isn't it a duck? One would ask me, ABO Meade, isn't duck a poultry? Yes my friend, it was a campaign to pout try not to die. The Vatican Pope John XXIII sent a plea to Kennedy and Khrushchev, and told them to calm things down and not let this mania end the world. He offered to mediate between them. I beg you to work things out. The Soviet ambassador in the US at the time, Anatoly Dobrinin, described when the Soviet ships met the American destroyers as a Western film with two heroes holding two guns confronting each other. While the world was holding its breath, the Soviet ships took steps back preceding the quarantine line with 5 miles. One would tell me, thank God, ABO Meade, it worked out. No, my friend. Then how are we alive now, ABO Meade? Just wait. According to the spy planes, the missile bases in Cuba were still getting ready. What? Yes. This put immense pressure on Kennedy from generals that thought he should have declared war from the start. We shouldn't wait till Washington is hit. Here, Kennedy decided, and for the first time in history, to raise the alert state to DEFCON 2. I don't get it, ABO Meade, but it feels serious. This was the last stage before DEFCON 1. DEFCON 1 was the state of nuclear war. The American B-52 plans circled the aerial space every 20 minutes, each plane carrying missiles enough to destroy 4 Soviet cities, while more than 100,000 Marines were situated at Florida, that turned into a military barrack ready to invade Cuba. While the world above waters was setting up an apocalypse, the real danger was underwater. Let's go back to the Soviet submarines settling underwater, where each submarine carried a nuclear torpedo. Makes sense, ABO Meade. There are nuclear missiles and nuclear on ships. Why not submarines too? The twist isn't here. The US authorities expected that after the 22nd of October there would be Soviet submarines, so they started looking for it. They sent to Khrushchev that in case they found just one Soviet submarine they would be demanded to rise to the surface, and go back to the Soviet without any clash. The twist is that the Soviet submarines underwater didn't know they were exposed, they didn't know any of that, the world was ending above them, and they had no clue. Their communication with the Soviet authorities was cut off days before. These submarines moved from Russia on the 1st of October, it had been in complete isolation for 25 whole days, especially after losing communication with the authorities. The communication officer in the B-59 submarine, Vadim Orlov, said that after this isolation, he managed to pick up radio waves from the US Miami, and he heard the news. The preparation of invading Cuba and an alert state of DEFCON 2. Oh crap, all the submarine staff thought that for sure the Third World War was on already and they knew nothing about it. Especially that communication with Russia was cut off. They picked up the American TV panicking just to show ads, and having clickbaits of how the nuclear war started. They had an existential question: how are we supposed to participate in this war? Did they decide themselves to release the nuclear torpedo? The protocol at the time was that the nuclear launch key was of 3 parts, each part with one of the staff officials, and the 3 officials had to agree on the decision before they activated the key that launched the nuclear torpedo. While I keep accusing you of being hasty in analyzing things as we talk calmly in an episode you're watching in the AC, the staff of the B-59 submarine was analyzing the news in harder conditions, disastrous conditions to take a decision like this. The Soviet submarines that were out on this mission operated on diesel engines. They were designed for conditions like the Arctic Ocean, where the diesel's temperature provided warmth for the staff. While in the Caribbean Sea, the water was already warm, the sea was hot and the submarines had been there for days. This made the temperature inside the submarine reach 60 degrees Celsius. The engines were overheated and the axe broke down. While the submarine's staff suffered from ulcers, rashes, dehydration, and breathing in the diesel air polluted with CO2, they were fed up, and you tell me that there's a nuclear war on top? During all these conditions and temperature, in order to preserve the water they had, each one of them was allowed to have 1 cup of water per day, in that hell, to save water. They were disastrous conditions for a military staff cut off from its command and trusted on a nuclear weapon. They now also believed there was a nuclear war on top, and they had to engage. Sorry Abo Meade, but why a diesel submarine in a mission like this? Why not a nuclear submarine? Actually, that's a valid point. The reason was the K-19. This was a Soviet nuclear submarine that had a malfunction in its cooling system in 1961. Its nuclear reactor leaked radiation for 22 of its staff being exposed to immense amount of radiation in a heroic and suicidal act, saving the world from a nuclear crisis, and killed them. So this wasn't going to be attempted again. Since then, the Soviet government decided to depend on the diesel until they figured out how to operate on nuclear fuel. Besides not being fit for Caribbean Sea, the diesel submarines had an even greater flaw. They needed to rise to the surface after some time to charge the diesel batteries. On the 26th of October 1962, the B-59 submarine had its staff battling thirst and CO2 poisoning while listening to war news, while the time that the batteries had left before needing to rise up was a few hours. You imagine, one call from the Soviet command was enough to fill them in on the situation, and then they would rise to the surface, charge the batteries, and go back home, with assurance from the US command that they wouldn't target the submarines, and once they rose up, they'd be left to go. The problem of communication that turned Cuban crisis into a horror film was also existent between commanders. The only safe way of communication between the US and Soviet presidents was letters. This caused that in a nuclear war where the minute counted, the communication between commanders was slow. For the letter to travel between US to Russia or vice versa needed 12 hours. On the 26th of October, Khrushchev sent to Kennedy a letter saying, "We both hold on to two ends of a rope's knot. If each one of us pulled, the knot will tighten and the world ends. Let's carefully untie the knot." That's commander's talk, not fishermen, by metaphor. While this letter renewed Kennedy's hope in Khrushchev wanting peace, in the same day a scary letter arrived to Khrushchev from Castro where he assured him that the US forces were close to invade Cuba, and that Khrushchev should start with a nuclear strike before it's too late. Afterwards, Khrushchev sent a letter to Kennedy conditioning the US to remove their missiles from Turkey to remove his missiles from Cuba in return. Here we arrive to the last and most important day of the Cuban Missile Crisis, on the 27th of October 1962. At 10:12 a.m. on the 27th of October, the Soviet forces in Cuba shot down an American spy plane and killed its pilot, Rudolf Anderson, although Khrushchev assured they wouldn't target the US planes. The crisis was at its climax. One of the US planes fell and one of its pilots died with Soviet fires. Kennedy then couldn't resist the generals who considered it an act of war. They demanded he declared the invasion of Cuba. That day, Kennedy's consultant Robert McNamara, while pointing out at the sunset during the meeting, said that this might be the last sunset the world would see. Brace yourselves. John Kennedy, in a secret and desperate move, away from his generals, asked his brother Robert to get in touch with the Soviet ambassador, Dobrynin, with a final agreement where the US declared it wasn't intending to invade Cuba, and in return, Khrushchev would declare dismantling the missiles. Kennedy secretly promised Khrushchev to withdraw missiles from Turkey after months to save the US face in front of the world and the NATO. This agreement was a desperate solution, because Kennedy was asking Khrushchev to trust him without guarantees, to only trust his word of removing the missiles, and in secrecy, he couldn't expose him to the world if he didn't do it. All of that while Kennedy was desperately waiting for Khrushchev's reply, and his generals kept pressuring him. One of your men was hit and killed by Soviet soldiers. Imagine how the world was like then. They were thinking that it could be their last sunset. At that time, the US destroyers located the Soviet submarine B-59, that not only had its battery almost dead, but also their staff was almost unconscious from CO2 poisoning. Their fingers were trembling towards the activation key of launching the torpedo. But the submarine was hit by training depth charges, and more than 4 US destroyers directed the sonar at it simultaneously. Sonar is just sound waves, and when directed from a source as large as a destroyer, it turned into passive torture, a torture that the communication officer Vadim Orlov described as being inside an oil drum. Beaten by a sledgehammer for 5 hours, the researcher Alexander Mozgovoy says that the submarine director Valentin Savitsky, during a state of nausea, poisoning, and semi-unconsciousness, thought that what he heard were real bombs, not training bombs sent for the submarine to rise to the surface. Although the Soviet protocol dictates that 3 bombs is a sign of safety, the US destroyers sent over 5 bombs. Some of them were real bombs in a clear rule-breaking as vengeance for the US plane that the Soviet took down. Captain Valentin Savitsky said, "We'll die, but we'll sink them all. If I go down, I'm taking everybody with me, and I have what it takes to do it." Indeed, he prepared the launch of the nuclear torpedo with the second official. At that moment everyone was waiting for the third official's confirmation to begin, Vasili Arkhipov, but among an exhausted staff from heat, training bomb charges, and a belief that the world above waters was nuclear ending, Vasili refused to launch the torpedo. He assured the other officials that these bombs were signals to rise up, not to drown the submarine. While the director accused Vasili of bringing shame to the country for being a coward and wanting to surrender, Vasili held his ground, refused to launch the nuclear torpedo, and demanded everyone to trust him. Here, we must ask, what made this man different? What made him hold on to wisdom in such a desperate situation? And to calm a staff that's on the verge of a breakdown and nuclear bombing the world? Let me tell you, that this Vasili we're talking about was one of the staff of the K-19, remember? Remember when you asked the question aimlessly about why this submarine operated on diesel, not nuclear fuel, and I told you the K-19 story that had a radiation leak killing most of its staff members, but Vasili was from the survivors. For the irony of it. See the world's and history's plot. In a moment where the world was ending, the world said, "Wait, there's a glitch. There's a dramatic plot I laid out for you. I got you someone to be in that specific submarine where the most important decision in the world then was taken." He was in the K-19 and saw most of his staff die of radiation poisoning. He saw what a small radiation leak could do to someone. That's why he believed that any solution would be better than any human would be subjected to a nuclear radiation that he caused. If that torpedo was launched, a third world war would have started. That would have killed people and ended life on the planet. The Second World War started with Japan striking Pearl Harbor. Imagine then striking the US fleet with a nuclear torpedo. That its power equated Hiroshima bomb. Indeed, my friend, one of the best thriller endings on this planet. The submarine declared surrender by rising to the surface. As its staff saved by Vasili rise to the surface after weeks, and they were expecting the US destroyers to be extremely violent, especially that they had a nuclear weapon, a nuclear torpedo, they were surprised that the US destroyers directed them to leave to the Soviet, go back and withdraw away from the quarantine. In that moment, the submarine staff realized that the US destroyers didn't know that the submarines carried nuclear weapon, which was a truth that remained hidden from the US for decades up until the archives were unlocked. While fate smiled to the Soviet, and they didn't destroy the world, fate also smiled to the US pilot Chuck Maltzby, who drove a spy plane next to Alaska, and as a result of being too close to the North Pole, his compass gave wrong directions and directed him to Siberia, where 6 Soviet planes crossed his path and the US command sent 2 F-102 planes to save him. Since the alert state was DEFCON 2, the planes were also loaded with nuclear warheads, and if not for the US pilots' skills to escape, the Soviet Union would have received US fighters with nuclear warheads inside its airspace. By the end of Black Saturday and beginning of the 28th of October 1962, and while the US forces were about to invade Cuba, the world listened to Moscow radio and the President Khrushchev announcing dismantling missiles and their removal from Cuba, as a signal for his acceptance to the secret agreement with Kennedy. Indeed, Kennedy also fulfilled his part of the secret deal. On the 20th of November, the quarantine around Cuba ended, and in April 1963, the US withdrew the Jupiter missiles from Turkey. The US, in agreement with the Soviet Union, for the first time decided to install a crisis hotline. We won't waste time sending letters on the verge of a nuclear war. Imagine calling a hotline and it says, "For Russian, click 1. So you go like, "Just blow up the world, it's a hotline, be quick." The Cuba Missile Crisis had its curse fall on all the heroes of the story. Kennedy was accused of poor management by his generals. Although his wisdom and patience avoided the world of a certain apocalypse, he was a hero. The US General Curtis LeMay described that agreement as the largest humiliating defeat in the US history. Khrushchev was ousted in October 1964, after accusing him of recklessness and taking a deal that humiliated the Soviet. Vasili Arkhipov, the hero of this epic, according to his wife, Olga, once he arrived at Russia, he was told, "Drowning with your submarine was more noble than what you did." He spent most of his life refusing to talk about the Cuba crisis, until he died of kidney cancer in 1998 as a result of the K-19 radiation. The analyst Strobe Talbot said that part of the country's ambition of owning nuclear weapons came from their trust that the US and the Soviet Union managed to live in peace during the Cold War, because of what's known as if two enemies had a destructive power, neither would destroy the other. because if you destroyed me, I'll destroy you. If they manage to live in peace with these weapons, then any country can do this too. In a crisis like the Cuba Missile Crisis, there would have been a nuclear war and the world would have exploded 3 or 4 times. The nuclear balance was fragile. The US and the Soviet were going to destroy the world. The details contained a million human error that was capable of leading to extinction by an inch. According to Tom Kalina from Disarmament Advocacy Group, what ABO mean? Luck? Can you see, my friend, the amount of plot twists? Of course there had to be luck. It's like a Muhammad Sami series. The man who was in K-19 and got exposed to radiation, so when there's a Black Saturday he was the man in charge and took a decision to stop the mania and stop the steps to a nuclear war. I always think about something. Many of us know Hiroshima because the disaster already happened, but most of us know nothing about the Cuba crisis, because it passed by. I always think about the alternatives. What would have happened if Kennedy asked for Cuba's invasion? Or if the nuclear submarine activated the key and launched the torpedo? Or if the US spy plane fell in Siberia? A small butterfly effect of one of these events, a wrong press of a button from a US fighter or a Soviet fighter, El Dahi wouldn't have been here. That would have been the real loss, you know, not the world or the US or all that. Sorry ABO Mead, but the crisis happened in the 60s. And was filled with faulty equipment, diesel, and late replies, were no developed with AI and technology. The security expert and professor in Pennsylvania University, Michael Horowitz, when he analyzed the Cuba crisis, said that the AI in such crisis would have made it a nuclear war. Why? Because there would have been no emotions or feelings. The givens of the solution for Cuba crisis weren't logic-based, the logical decision, and I assure you, if I were there, the logic dictated launching the torpedo. I'm already dying, and there's a war outside, there are people counting on me, and I don't know where I stand in the war, and most of the people in the submarine wanted to launch it, they see it's the right thing to do. That was the logic-based decision. This feels like the world is strange. Something like Kennedy's hesitation and determination on delaying war would have been refused by the AI. Khrushchev's agreement on a secret deal based on the variable honored US president, the president my friend, not his honor, don't set us up, we don't want a diplomatic crisis with the White House. According to Michael, the AI would have shortened the crisis from 2 weeks to 2 hours. A time window that wouldn't have allowed the emergence of Vasili Arkhipov, who saved the world last minute based on a moral emotional decision falling on a trauma he witnessed when he was exposed to radiation. My friend, please, can you think about it every once in a while? Because this feels very thought-provoking. According to the submarine's director Ryurik Kotov, Savitsky's decision of launching the torpedo was the most logical. In the film, Dark Knight, the Joker gives 2 teams a bombing device and each team knew if they didn't press the button first the other team would press the button and destroy it. But his plan fails when both teams decide not to start the fight. They confidently decide that this is the right decision without guarantees. In the end, logic is what made the world build an atomic bomb to race Hitler before he built it, and logic leaked the secret of the bomb to reach Russia for them to make mutual assured destruction. But to reach a safe world, we can't do it without a human faith and trust. Lacking logic, that we end up fighting it. The trust between us and the others, no matter who they are, deserves that we live in peace on our terms, not the Joker's. Even if all the logical givens assure us at one moment that destruction is the solution. Just like Vasili Arkhipov's faith that the enemy wouldn't kill him, or Kennedy's faith in delaying war, or Khrushchev's final decision in believing Kennedy's promise. These were all faiths, but saved the world, although they destroyed those who had them and got them accused of shame. In the end, our humanity is determined by our achievements and inventions, but in the hardest times, it can be determined by a moral decision that logic doesn't support. That the world fits everyone. Maybe our life threatened by nuclear extinction every minute would actually end in a disastrous scenario, or maybe in a moment of understanding and trust, we can reach a safer world, or at least try to. Or as Kennedy said, that's why, my friend, in any time where there's tension, violence, and worry, don't forget to watch the old episodes and the new ones, look at the sources, and subscribe if you're on YouTube. I have a small reflection I'd like to share, that the world always considers, what did you do? And not that sometimes the most important thing you did could be not doing something. That's what we get from this story. These were people who didn't do things that could have destroyed the world, but no one remembers them by this. I have to excuse myself out to go do nothing as well, maybe it would be useful.